This podcast is brought to you by Ngrok. If data is the lifeblood of a modern IT organization, Ngrok is the circulatory system moving that data from where it is to where it needs to be with a seamless, easy-to-use SaaS offering. Maybe you're trying to standardize the application delivery policies for your organization across multiple data centers or cloud environments. Or you're building a SaaS offering that needs to deploy and manage software inside customers' networks that you don't control. Or you need to be able to connect to IoT devices regardless of which network those devices live on. Ngrok allows you to access that data in a way that is both developer and CISO friendly. For more information, contact Ngrok today. And now, on to our show.
Can I get the icon in cornflower blue?
Hey everybody, welcome to episode 28 of Can I Get That Software in Blue? I'm one of your hosts, Chad Tyndall. Along with me is my co-host with market insight that's never off track. In the world of AI, he's leading the attack. The Emperor of Empathy, Steve Mazak, everybody.
Thanks, Chad. Good morning.
How do you like that, by the way, that Emperor of Empathy moniker? Was that working for you?
Yeah, I think it's hilarious. I actually got a comment from my sister. She texted me about one of the intros you did the other day. She thought it was pretty funny. So
I love it. I love it. Well, we're joined today by a special guest, someone I've known for almost 20 years. We both started our careers at HP after university, and we were both very involved in the early days of open source there. She created and managed HP's open source program office in 2002, and ever since then, she's been high-flying in various open source ecosystems. She was the executive director and later a board member of the Gnome Foundation, a director of the Mozilla Development Network. She sat on the board of directors for the Software Freedom Conservancy. She was vice president of developer relations for the Cloud Foundry Foundation, and she was director of the open source programs office at Microsoft. Currently, she's on the board of directors at the Linux Foundation and is vice president of communities at GitHub. And she also runs a nonprofit called Kids on Computers, which is a charity she founded to set up computer labs in schools for kids with no access to technology. Hopefully you're understanding here how deeply dedicated she is to the idea of open source and serving communities. She's a leader who never falters with a passion for community that never alters. A major force in the world of open source with a career that soars and never teeters. We're thrilled to welcome the remarkable Stormy Peters. Welcome to the show.
Thanks, Chad. That's the best introduction I've ever had.
I mean, seriously, I'm jealous.
That's what we're shooting for here. Overwhelming achievement, I guess. Well, we're happy to have you here today, and we got a lot of topics to talk about because your career is so broad and varied, and we want to touch on a lot of it. So let's just dive right in here. You're one of the OGs of open source, at least in terms of the corporate world and corporate adoption of open source. So how did you get exposed to open source, and how did that, I mean, it's almost like it became a sort of calling for you.
I feel like I started my career in open source software my career in general in just the right time. I was actually at Hewlett-Packard, as you mentioned, and I was running the CDE team, which is the user interface for HPUX for Unix, kind of what GNOME and KDE are in the Linux world. And I went to the standards meeting, and I was appalled or shocked or horrified to find out that all of these big companies had big teams of people writing software that did exactly the same thing in their own code bases. And I just remember sitting there looking around the room as we decided which bug we were all going to fix in our code bases so that we could all be exactly the same with what bugs we had fixed. I thought, what a waste of time. Like, I have 30 engineers working on this, and so do all of them, and there's got to be a better way. So luckily for me, Linux had come around, and they had not just one, but two open source desktops, GNOME and KDE. And I was like, let's go work on that together. So that's how my career got started. But turned out not to be a technical problem, turned out to be a business problem, how to convince everybody open source was okay.
Yeah, I feel very lucky to have started my career at that time, too. I mean, I was doing Linux kernel programming in college, and that's kind of why HP hired me, right, to port HP apps from HPUX to Linux. So we were kind of working on similar things there and trying to get HP to really embrace and adopt open source in the early days when we were still arguing about open source licenses and what to use and all that early day conversations that most of the time people don't talk about too much anymore.
When you were having those conversations early in your career about this, and it's funny, it seems obvious in hindsight as to how you arrived at this conclusion. Was it scary for the executive team, the leadership team, to think about free and open source, potentially turning what could have become or was a profit stream into something that wouldn't be that anymore?
I think it was much less of a concern. So my project CDE was much less of a concern of we were going to stop making money and more of I was going to accidentally copyleft something that I shouldn't, that they would have to give away all of HPUX because I had inserted this piece of open source software. So Luckily, we had awesome attorneys as well that got involved. Just a really great team there that helped explain how it all worked. No one actually really knew how it all worked. The attorneys were trying to guess what would happen if it ever went to court and figure it out.
Did you have scanning software back then to scan the code and make sure there was nothing that would infringe? I can't imagine that existed back then.
We wrote it.
You wrote it, okay.
Yeah.
Did we open source that and provide it to other people too, or was that just private to HP?
We did. Bob Gobiel open sourced it and represented it as Fossology, right? I'm pretty sure it's been a little while, but it's Fossology.
Yeah, I thought I remembered opening that up, and then Phil Robb was running things. Well, let's talk about these foundations. So you're really a professional juggler of foundations. That's how Steve was describing you. After HP, you ran the Gnome Foundation. How did you pick Gnome as the foundation to go run? And let's talk about the foundation experience. How do you get onto a foundation? What do you actually do when you're on the board of one of these open source foundations?
Yeah, it really varies by the foundation. So GNOME was like coming full circle because I had originally arranged for GNOME to be ported over to HPOX. I had worked with, Helix Code, which then became Symbian, which then got bought. And so when the GNOME Foundation decided they were going to hire an executive director, I knew all of them and it sounded like great fun and an awesome opportunity. The GNOME Foundation is a super hands-on board. It's people that work on the GNOME project. It's developers. They do a lot of the work. There's very few employees of the GNOME Foundation. I think it's still only 2. Getting on the board is just being very active in the project and being willing to pitch in and then expressing interest. To be in the GNOME board of directors, you actually have to be a GNOME contributor. Like you have to be a member of the GNOME project. Other boards are less, like the Linux Foundation board is also very active, but in a very different way. They have a lot of employees that run all of the projects and keep everything going. And so as a board member, we participate in the meetings, have lots of conversations, make sure that we're representing projects appropriately, that voicing opinions and making sure things run well, but we don't do the day-to-day work of the Linux Foundation.
As part of the mission of the foundations, is it just to be the stewards of the project, not necessarily decide the direction the project heads as a technology, but more as a community?
That also depends on the foundation, but most foundations in open source software try to keep the technical work separate from the financial support.
So then when you have these, I guess, are there kind of stated goals for the foundation? And if so, I'd love to hear just an example of what those might be, just because I've never been in part of one.
But you probably, if you think about it, kind of know inherently, like the Apache Foundation is they don't decide on the technical things of the project. They created infrastructure. They aren't looking for large corporate donations. They're looking to remain independent. The Gnome Foundation runs the actual project, provides any infrastructure funding that needs to happen, pulls together all of the companies that want to financially sponsor the project, gives them a voice, not necessarily a voting direction on where things go, but gives them a voice on the advisory board. The Linux Foundation is a 501c6, which brings together a lot of companies that put in a lot of financial support for projects, but the projects are then run by technical committees and the maintainers themselves.
That makes sense. So when the economy yins and yangs, ebbs and flows, is there any issue with funding for the foundations during tough times, or is it pretty steady?
I think COVID was a really good test of that. It seems to have maintained steady. There were a couple efforts in the beginning. A lot of projects and a lot of foundations get a lot of their money from events. So there was a hit when events went away because it's an easy way for companies to sponsor, like their marketing departments understand giving money to an event. And so that's how a lot of projects brought in money. So there was a big effort then among the community to raise money and to try to help keep that money flowing into the projects.
I don't know if it's a good question to ask. I was going to say, kind of set the context of I understand the purpose of the Linux Foundation in the sense that there's so many companies who build businesses on top of Linux, competing corporate interests and all of that. So they want to have a sort of neutral, non-profit way that they can all talk about and help run things. And because Linux is the biggest of the open source projects, I get that. But for these other smaller open, GNOME isn't as big as Linux. It's not as used by as many people as Linux. There's probably not as many companies behind it and all of that. So I was just trying to understand really, do you think going forward, given the nature of the changes to open source and the fact that we're seeing more projects in open source be sort of dominated by one company, is there a need for a foundation in that type of model? Like where a company open sources their product, let's say MongoDB open sources their product, Elastic open sources their product, but it's not really run by a consortium of companies. It's one company that's behind it. Should they be setting up foundations to sort of steward the community at all there?
It depends on what they're trying to accomplish. So I think foundations provide a way, as you said, for companies to work together. It gives them a framework and an understanding of how they're going to collaborate, makes it clear who's going to own the IP, puts it kind of in a neutral third party's hands that they can all benefit from. I also think it holds money. It's hard if you have 20 people working on a project and the project gets money, whose bank account does it go into, and who's going to pay taxes on it? And then what do you do with that money? It can be complicated. But I do think that we need to move beyond just the foundation model. So at GitHub, we're experimenting. We recently announced GitHub Fund, which is kind of like an accelerator for open source software startups, because it's hard when you're a startup building open source software to convince venture capitals that you have secret sauce or something secret that they should fund. We have sponsors, which is a way individuals or companies can donate to maintainers that they appreciate what they're working on or the software. So I guess to answer your question, I think foundations are still very useful, still needed for some projects, and we have to come up with new models that fit the new world.
Are there certain kinds of businesses that would be better, in the sense more profitable as an open source model versus a cloud SaaS model? How would you make that decision as a founder now?
I'm a pretty strong believer that the software is not the secret sauce. It's the implementation and the people that you have working on it and the customers' problems that you're trying to solve. So I think it's highly unlikely if you open source your software that someone's going to come steal your software and launch a alternative startup and beat you, unless they're just better at execution and you weren't doing well. I would by default start with open source, because then you open yourself to lots of collaboration. I think the projects that most benefit from being an open source are ones that set themselves up to be very modular and extensible. I provide a core value, but I make it really easy if you want to. I'm trying to think of a good example, but like say I build something for cell phones and I just make it really easy for everyone to make it run on their own model of cell phone or be able to tweak it for their own home environment or whatever I have. If the more modular it is, I think it's easier for people to add extensions and add-ons to it than to like dive into like a big monolithic code base and decide to like fix a bug.
Logstash is a good example of that, actually, from Elastic. Jordan Sissel created that a long time ago, and there's like tons and tons of plugins created by the community. So yeah, it's like a good integration hub.
Well, but we have seen these issues, for example, using Elastic again, where, Amazon started up a competing SaaS offering using the open source thing. And then there was some brouhaha around that and a license change and those types of things, preventing cloud vendors from using their open source software, without remuneration. So how do those issues play out moving forward, do you think? You think that's the model open source companies should use, kind of preventing other people from monetizing it?
I hope that we can come up with models that benefit both sides, like that I can continue my business and the customers I serve. I do think that there's rising awareness among companies that they're leveraging open source software. They want to offer it to their customers need it, and so they're offering it. But I think there's rising awareness that they need to compensate the original author or maintainer. I think we've especially seen this with security issues, where they want to make sure that their supply chain is secure, and they realize in order to do that some of the benefit has to flow back to the maintainers. Because we get a lot of questions from customers on like, I'd like to give back to the open source software dependencies that I have, but how do I do that? And they're concerned about like, if I give 100,000, does that look fair? Or does that look like not fair? And how do I give it to all of my dependencies? And what about all the things they depend on? Often the frontline projects get most of the money, and then the things they depend on aren't visible at all and don't get funded, and end up being that like critical piece that might have a security vulnerability, and it's like one person that wrote it 5 years ago, and they've moved on. Whereas maybe if they'd been getting some funding, they would have spent a few hours every week making sure everyone was happy with it.
That's a great point, actually, because it's like dependency after dependency for these projects, and the one that grows in popularity usually will get the funding. So Stormy, in the GitHub model, with the way that you're thinking about it, how are you going to tackle that problem? Like, is there kind of a trickle down way that you can pay the sub projects all the way down?
It's not super easy yet, but we're working on that path. So you can see, we have an OSPO dashboard where you can see all your dependencies. You can also see all your dependencies. We also recently added bulk sponsorships, so you could pick lots of projects and sponsor all of them at once. That was a challenge. And so we're getting to the step where we could tell companies, hey, click this button and you can fund all of your dependencies, including their dependencies.
Well, and so GitHub leverages a lot of open source in the building of its technology as well. Have you sponsored these companies yourselves? Like, are these open source projects yourselves?
Yeah, we give out a lot in just GitHub consumables like actions and whatnot. We provide a lot of support for open source software projects. Last year, we also decided to fund all of our dependencies. We took $500,000 last June and just spread it out among all of our dependencies. We were also a little worried, like, does it look like not enough to each project? And so we ended up giving each project $500 and something. And I remember Ashley Wolf on my team was like, should we just give them 500? Does that look better? And I'm like, no, just divide everything we've got among everybody. And it was really well received.
That's awesome. What you were saying earlier, like, is it fair? Did anyone have any comments to the contrary where they're like, oh, this doesn't feel fair? Thank you, but no thank you?
No, I didn't see any of those. Everyone seemed very grateful. Everyone's very hopeful that the models that we're trying out and playing with will work. So everything from providing free hosting and, $120 million worth of action minutes to giving money like this, but not just us giving money, but like enabling other companies to do it. And I think there has to be some norms around it. Like we're really working on like, what do we recommend, or like, how do we make it just something you do?
It's so interesting because I just thought about this, like, it's kind of like the world of social media and influencers is sort of blending with open source, where, a social media creator can make millions and just by putting out videos and doing that work, yet a developer who they rely on without even knowing it could be toiling away and living off of ramen and corn or something. Like, so interesting to me to start thinking about how to bring these together.
It is really interesting, but I'm really committed to making sure that we don't make developers have to be social media experts. I would say the folks that are doing best on sponsors right now, like six figures, are people that are very good at social media. We even have one maintainer that whenever he sees a mention of his project in Twitter, he goes and says, "Hey, I wrote that. Would you like to donate and sponsors to me?" And companies do, like, because to them, like $500 is like, oh, wow, of course we'll give you $500. I hope that we create a world where it's a norm and not where like all three of us have to like go out and fundraise for our own personal salaries.
Well, speaking of that, I mean, you mentioned that you're starting to hear about VCs questioning the value of open source during pitches and things like that. I think that's what you said. Is there any reason to believe that fundraising for a company is easier if it's open source, or easier if it's not open source? Or that the valuation multiples are higher if it's open source or not open source? Do you know any of the data there?
I don't know all the data there. Nadia Ekbal has written a couple of books on this about funding in open source and how it should be about public infrastructure. She came to talk to me before she wrote her books. And at the time she was in venture capital, and she actually thought we should be funding more open source software, which is how she ended up going down this research path and writing the book. So if you wanted to do another podcast, she'd be really interesting to talk to about that. But what we're trying to do at GitHub is we partnered with Microsoft's M12 fund, which is a venture capital fund, and we put aside $1 million specifically for open source software projects.
This is the GitHub Accelerator project you guys announced?
This is the GitHub fund. The GitHub Accelerator is like another stage in the life cycle. So for the Accelerator, we took 20 maintainers who want to take their project to the next level. Maybe they want to create a company, or maybe they just want to grow their project. And we put them in a 10-week program where they have each other as a cohort, and we have mentorships and training, and we give them $2,000 a week so that they can focus on their project, hopefully. We're just trying to see what they need to get to the next step. I'm hoping we'll continue with Accelerator, but I'm also hoping we can build more into the GitHub product to help them as their projects reach different stages, give them the support that they need.
All right, so you're almost running that like a startup accelerator.
Yeah.
What does GitHub take as part of that? Do you guys get equity in return if they start a company, or like a startup accelerator might, or how does that work?
From the Accelerator, we're not getting anything. It's just a program to help launch their projects and for us to learn what they might need that we could build into the product for future projects. The GitHub fund it's through M12, Microsoft's venture capital fund. So yeah, there's some kind of equity.
The people who go through the GitHub Accelerator, what generally is their goal at the end of that? Are they trying to then take it to a VC after that and raise money to start a business, or what are you seeing there in the early days?
We're in our first cohort, so I think we're about halfway through right now. So not even. So I don't know exactly what's going to happen with all of them. I'm curious myself. We have everything from people who have full-time day jobs who've written this project in their free time that are trying to see if they could make a go at it and be able to focus full-time on it. So I imagine most of them would love to start a company or see their GitHub sponsors fund grow enough that they could live off of it. We have students who are just starting their career and they've been successful in open source and want to see if that's a career path that they could take without, getting a paycheck and an employer. So it's going to be interesting.
Along your career journey, you made a stop at the Cloud Foundry Foundation, and I was at Pivotal for a while. So I was just curious, like, what was that what drew you there, and what was that experience like?
Yeah, I had been working mostly talk about scratching your own itch, mostly in the desktop space, the web space, the space that we all live in. And so the thought of going and helping the cloud be part of the open source software world was really exciting, as I'm sure you know from Pivotal. I also found the pair programming model really interesting. I don't think we really figured out how that works in a distributed open source environment, but it's a really interesting challenge.
It's tricky to do. When Chad and I were at Elastic, we used to have this always on Zoom that anyone could join and work together. And it was on one of the TVs in the offices that we had. So like as you're eating lunch, you would see people working on this thing and they could see you and you could see them and you could wave, but you couldn't hear them. And it was like one of the attempts to do like pair programming remotely, but out in the open. It was kind of fun. So you were VP of DevRel there. That's not a position I would normally have thought about as part of a foundation, just based on our earlier conversation. Is that another common thing that foundations do, is have developer relations to try and go, grow the popularity of the project? Is that the point? Is it to spread awareness and make it more popular?
It was really interesting because I think it actually meant different things to different members of Cloud Foundry. So what I very much was focused on was bringing new developers to the platform, like people that wanted to work on Cloud Foundry and code, which is why the pair programming model and the dojo, like go spend time in it, was like a really interesting challenge. Even metrics were a challenge, right? If a pair checks in code, whose code is it? Most open source software projects tools aren't set up to like give credit to two people for it.
God, I never even thought about that before.
Well, you can just do the @author thing. I'm old Java guy, so like I would have just added them as an author in the class file.
But in the commit log, you're saying, the GitHub commit log.
But then I think a lot of members really thought about developer relations as technical marketing, which is also fair. And I think actually something much more reasonable for a foundation to fund would be developer marketing.
I've known this guy, Josh Long, for a long, long time. We wrote a book together. He wrote the whole book, basically, and gave me credit for it. But he's developer relations at Pivotal, and he was there back when they were Spring Source. And he's kind of a celebrity now, like in a good way. He goes to these cities, to these conferences, and people get selfies with him, and he's always trying to help them just learn about the projects, which I always loved. And it was such a cool thing to see him and his team going out and, educating people, getting more people interested in the projects. So it was advertising, but it wasn't like a self-serving thing. It was a give-get type of thing. The DevRel teams I've worked with in the past, that's always what it's been about, is go help the community. Just teach them, basically. And the rest will happen kind of organically.
Yeah, DevRel at GitHub is the same. Let's go teach people about open source software and about Git and how to use GitHub.
Are people using GitHub are university students using it for all their projects? Are they like coming out of college already knowing how to use it?
It is really exciting. So we have a GitHub education program that works with both the educators and the students. And with the students, what's really exciting, especially during COVID, we really saw it grow, is we have campus experts. So these are students that are just passionate about writing software, passionate about GitHub, and they agree to like help other students learn. And so they create Twitch channels and they have meetups and they teach all their fellow students about GitHub.
That's awesome. I mean, that was always a problem with any other project. People would come out of college, but they've never used a real database before. They kind of have to learn all that on the job. So companies are always trying to move into that education environment so people come out already knowing how to use their stuff. That's great.
Yeah, and we're seeing more and more teachers also use it in their classes. So we have a GitHub Classroom project that helps them use actions to hand out assignments and grade. So I think we have like over 100,000 teachers right now that are using GitHub as part of the way they run their classes. They're also trying to figure out how AI fits into the world of teaching kids how to write code these days. So that's been an interesting and fun journey.
You're like a professional guest because you're pivoting right to the very next topic that we had on the agenda. So let's talk about AI because that's obviously the story of the year. Let's just talk about that question. So in the education sense, in the education world, how are you starting to see this play out in terms of kids using AI to generate code and turn in assignments? And is that going to be allowed, or are professors going to embrace that and just kind of realize that that's the nature of the world? So they have to change the way they teach and evaluate students?
Yes, I think they are. But I think the journey to get here was interesting. It was a very fast journey. But when we first released Copilot, we gave it away for free to all students. We made a mistake. We did not give it away free to all teachers at first. So they were kind of like, what about us? And you're letting all of our students cheat and we can't even see how this works. So they were very much worried in the beginning that students were going to cheat. I think we've seen a huge pivot. Like when we went to SIGC, the big education conference in North America recently, teachers are very much like, how do I use this in the classroom to help students? Like, how does it show them different ways of doing things? How do I teach them prompt crafting? Like, how do I have them kind of show how they got to the final solution? I actually played around with it with my kids. One of my sons is taking computer science in high school, and he was supposed to write a game. It was like their month-long project. And so I went to ChatGPT, not to Copilot, and I said, write Hangman in Python. And it spit me back a working Hangman game. It used a graphics library, which I thought was a little complicated if you didn't know how to code. So I said, write me Hangman in Python without a graphics library, and it spit me back an ASCII version. So I sent it to my son, but I said, don't turn this in for your project.
Just the language that you use, the nature that it would be considered cheating to use an AI tool to help you out, is that idea going to change? Because the nature of the world is such that the analogy I want to say is, if you ask someone to go build some kitchen cabinets, it's not cheating if you use a table saw or a power tool or something like that. It's just a tool that makes it faster and maybe produces a better result in the end than being out there with a handsaw and some chisels.
And you have to learn how to use those tools, right? If you got out of construction trade school and didn't know how to use those power tools, you would really question the education you'd gotten, because you kind of need to use them on the job. So I think it's a lot like calculators and slide rules. These tools came about. We worried when calculators first came out, you would forget how to do multiplication tables. I was really shocked that my kids got to use calculators in math class. I didn't get to do that till I got to programming calculators. So I think the tools available to us are constantly evolving. What I do think stays the same is how people who program need to think about the problem. You need to lay it out, understand the data structures, understand how things interact. That even if something else fills in all the code for you, you have to have that type of thinking to be able to take a real world problem and turn it into software.
Well, there was that report that came out, or research study, about how the smarter you are, the better results you get from prompt engineering, which kind of fits in with what you're just saying. Is you have to know the right questions to ask. You have to know how to direct it to do the thing you want to do. So this idea that, let's just say my daughter, who's an esthetician, could use ChatGPT to build a program, I would say maybe, but it's probably going to be rudimentary at best. And when something goes wrong, she wouldn't have the first idea of how to fix it. So I agree with you in the sense that this AI, like many tools before it, will just be an accelerant for the people that learn how to use it to the best of their ability.
I was just going to push back on that notion a little bit, that you do have to know all that stuff. I don't want to say I'm rejecting your premise, but I'm questioning your premise that you have to know all that stuff. Because, for example, to draw another analogy, people can write an iPad app, and they don't necessarily have to know how a system call gets invoked in the Linux kernel, or how file systems work at a low level, or be able to implement a red-black tree, or do the big O analysis on a data structure and algorithm, right? But they can still be very functional programmers. So I guess I'm asking, in the future, is it really the case that people have to know how all that fits together? Or does it just become, no, that's already handled for me and I don't have to worry about it anymore?
I think the simple problems will become like that. You'll be able to solve your problems. If you want to write some code that sorts all your photos by some feature that your photo editor doesn't do, that should be really easy. But if you want to write something that figures out multiple elevators in a hotel and, which one should go to which floor, it requires a little more understanding algorithms and how things work. And over time, hopefully that line keeps going up, right? Just, that the tools can do more and more of it for you. I actually think when it comes to education in high school, we should really focus on what kinds of problems computers can solve for you instead of how to write the code. Because if your daughter's an esthetician, it's much more useful for her to know what she could expect a computer to solve for her.
So she's applying it in different ways. When I showed her ChatGPT, she was struggling at the time with how to write Instagram posts for her business to advertise. And I was like, just ask ChatGPT. And she had it, after she learned how to use it, she had it create a whole year-long schedule that included holidays and stuff like that. So now she's got this spreadsheet with all these ideas, and she just kind of hits go when it's ready to go.
That's awesome.
Yeah. I liken it to Excel users. 80% of the people probably use 20% of the functionality. And I imagine that's what AI will be like for a while, where the easy stuff, like you said, Stormy, will be easy, but the hard stuff will still be, it'll become more and more possible, and we'll get through it faster, but it'll still be hard stuff for a little while, I think.
Do you think it will help all those people that use spreadsheets as databases to finally be able to use a real database?
I have had this conversation with a friend of mine because I invested in a company that's a spreadsheet AI company. And we joke about it a lot. If Excel has been like this, it's kind of the cockroach of technologies. So I don't know. I think it's just going to keep going.
I think Microsoft's going to be introducing various Copilot things that make it even more powerful and keep it alive. I don't think it's going anywhere.
When I got the ChatGPT plugin for Google Sheets, I was excited. That's
100%
much of a geek I am. Yeah.
Yeah.
So yes, I think Excel will be around for a long time.
We have a lot of like database tools that are getting easier to use. So someday people use databases for databases.
We talked about this on a previous episode where people are starting to query databases or do analytics type questions in natural language, ChatGPT types of things. Generate me a graph that uses this data set, and I want to ask these questions using English. I don't want to write SQL queries and have it go do that for you. And that seems to be, I'm starting to see that pop up more and more in the analytics space, which is really exciting.
So I tried that problem actually. So I'm allergic to something in some sunscreens. And if you've ever looked at the bottle on a sunscreen, there's like a gazillion ingredients in it. So I took 7 sunscreens, a couple of which I was allergic to and a bunch of which I wasn't. And I tried to use ChatGPT to figure out which ingredients they had in common because I was just being lazy. It actually gave me wrong answers, like just flat out wrong. But then I used Copilot and I wrote code, and I very much had to say, create an array with these ingredients and tell me which elements are common. I had to kind of spell it out a little more, but it gave me an accurate response.
I had a similar problem where I'm coaching my son's Little League team, and I wanted to give all the players on the team, and I wanted to have it draw the roster for me, given a bunch of constraints, like make sure nobody plays outfield 2 innings in a row. These people can pitch, catch, and play first base, those types of things. And make sure nobody plays the same position twice in the same inning. Because it was doing that. It would be like, well, put this position, the same player at 3 positions so I can satisfy your constraint. And it just couldn't do it. But then I had it write code to generate the roster, and it was fine. So that seems like the way to do it, because it just doesn't have enough working memory right now to keep it all in track and stay on the task that you've given it. It's really frustrating.
But I think that also shows how we'll still need to understand programming skills, like that way of thinking, right? Because you kind of laid out the structure for it then.
Yeah, I think that's because that's how it is now. I'm just thinking 5-10 years from now, that problem I hope will go away, or tools like AutoGPT can start functioning better. And I'm going to call ChatGPT iteratively and work on these goals for you. Those higher level types of tools hopefully will be better in the future than they are today. I mean, they're just getting started.
I never thought about using ChatGPT for an allergy, but I don't know if it's an allergy, but when I eat ancho chili, I get insomnia. And so I just asked it like, hey, what are the most common foods that has ancho chilies? I'm allergic and I would like to know which foods to avoid. It didn't give me the, this avoid this exact thing. It's just, it's found in chili sauces or chili powders. It's found in marinades. Yeah, okay. Thank you. But I knew that. It's to ask if it's in there.
I bet if you got the prompt right though, because all the foods list their ingredients on some website somewhere. So you could say, yeah, of all the websites that list food ingredients, which ones show chilies?
Well, and I just got the ChatGPT web browsing plugin a couple days ago, so I'm going to try that this weekend now. It's a good idea.
Well, so GitHub is at the center of this controversy around the training of LLM models, large language models, using open source software for Copilot, of course, using whatever's on the web for, not that GitHub is involved with ChatGPT, but Microsoft is invested in OpenAI. And there's starting to be these websites that have a huge data corpus that offer a lot of value. Reddit, Quora, Stack Overflow, these types of things, who are now talking about saying, maybe you can't use our websites, you can't scrape our websites to train your LLM models, or you'll have to pay us if you do, right? We want some licensing fee for that. Do you think this idea of an AI.txt file, so like how the robots.txt file controls search engine indexing, will become some sort of de facto standard for who can train what using LLMs?
So I think it's definitely a conversation we're all having right now. We very much want to give users and developers the tools that they need to develop software the way they want and to have that software used the way they want. It's not as straightforward as it's not always straightforward how to solve the problem. So we have added features to like Copilot where you can say, if you're going to make a suggestion of, I forget over how many characters, I say 140, but I'm probably thinking of Twitter. If you make a suggestion of over 140 characters, if that suggestion is found in any public repo on GitHub, please don't include it in my code. I don't want to use it. So we're trying to give tools to people to use it. We're also working on the attribution problem, but often the things that we find are found in 2,000 repos. So where did it start?
He's copying code from each other. When you go to Stack Overflow and copy a code snippet, what's wrong with that? What's the difference, really?
I want to play pro Copilot here for a little bit.
Absolutely.
So when it first came out, I was like stunned. Like, this is such a cool tool because I haven't coded in a while. To me, it feels like a way to accelerate the software development by doing what developers are already doing, but they maybe don't want to admit out loud, which is going and copying code off of other repos and other projects to move faster. Or they just use the project themselves. So like, they can't be upset. I don't think they can be upset about the fact that they just made that easier. But there seems to be some dissonance between someone using my open source project in their project and making money, and I may never know about it. But now that I know that someone's using my code to help them write code faster, that's not okay. That seems kind of odd to me. When you talk to folks about Copilot, what are the reasons they love it? Like, why is it such a great tool for them? Because I'm sure there's both sides, right? Some people don't like it enough to join a class action, but I'm sure people are getting a lot of value out of it as well.
So developers are definitely getting a lot of value out of it. The feedback from people that are using Copilot is overwhelmingly positive, and companies and individuals are saying it makes their lives easier. So I talked to Ben, I forgot your last name, who works for the Norwegian Refugee Council. And during the Ukrainian crisis, they changed their model. Instead of having people apply for funding or resources and then reviewing it and, giving it, they decided they could just, from wherever they are, apply for money and say, I need money right now. Here's the situation I'm in. And they would give them money. So he had to write a whole bunch of software to enable this. And he used Copilot. And he said it was like having a pair programmer. It was like having a code developer sitting next to him. And it's the only reason he got it out so fast. So it's overwhelmingly been a useful tool to people. I think the problem comes back to recognition. Like, people want recognition for the work that they've done. And I mean, we've seen in the past, like in the beginning of open source, do y'all remember the beer license? Somebody wrote a beer license that said, yeah, if you see me at a conference, you need to buy me a beer. And the company I was at said, we can't use any software license under the software because we can't guarantee that all of our employees will recognize this guy at a conference and buy him a beer. So we can't comply with it. So we can't use the software.
This is right. Where humor goes to die is the legal team.
Well, they wanted to do the right thing and recognize what the guy wanted. So I think it comes down to that. So I think it's, how could we use GitHub sponsors to fund money back to the code that have proven most valuable? Like, how do we provide ways of recognition and rewards, not the right way, but if there's value on one end, how do we make it flow to the beginning, to the dependencies?
Yeah, that's fair. So just real quick, for Carl and Dave and Aaron, the lawyers that I know and talk to, you are funny. Just know that. But at work, you're not funny.
Personally, they're funny.
Professionally,
they're all business.
Which I also find hilarious, but whatever. So
I really came to love attorneys in the beginning of the open source software movement because they were like so fascinated by it and enjoyed talking about it and walking through scenarios so much that I was like, wow, these people think a bit like programmers and like they're fun to work with.
On the Copilot thing, let's take the counter side, or this blend where you're doing the investments in open source projects. And I know there's other companies talking about gating their content for LLMs. So like, if you're going to crawl our content and include it in your LLM, you need to pay us so that we can pay the creators. Is that where you kind of think we might end up here, given the recent investments and announcements GitHub made in terms of trying to solve this problem where people can get compensated for open source?
Yeah, and I think your question was like, the funding that we give to the people that provide things that large language models learn on? I'm a big fan of open data and like letting everybody learn and evolve on it. I do think there'll be some kind of business on people that have large data sets that they provide for learning that aren't open. I think that's actually a problem for the open source software community. I think the fact that some AIs will have access to more data than other AIs is something we all need to focus on as well.
Well, let's talk about your Kids on Computers charity that you started. What's that all about? You founded that? You were the creator of it?
I think it's funny how it got started. I had a coworker, guy on my team, and we were getting rid of a bunch of computers. And he was from India. And he was like, Stormy, we should send these to India. Like, people there would really appreciate them. And I had just imported a bunch of new equipment to India for our team there. And I was like, no way, cannot import used equipment to India. Like, take too long, too much paperwork. But then I somehow mentioned that at a keynote that I gave at Scale. And after the keynote, someone came up to me and he's, Stormy, if you do that, I want to help. I was like, okay. And I walked off. And then I was at Scale the next year and this guy came and found me and he's, Stormy, what happened? I thought we were going to do this thing. And I was like, oh. And my parents had just moved to rural Mexico. They were teaching at a Mixteca school. And I was like, you know what? I bet I could find us a school. So my dad helped find us our first school. whole bunch of people from Scale and other conferences helped us find computers to install Linux on them. We got a grant from FedEx to ship them there, luckily, because they got stuck in customs for a while, and FedEx helped us push them through. And so that's how it got started. Just a bunch of people that wanted to take computers that weren't useful here anymore and help kids learn about open source software and technology.
I know when I started at Red Hat, the one laptop per child project was going strong at the time, and I'm a big fan of these projects that help bridge the digital divide, because like you said, technology is the silver bullet that can solve all these problems, but they got to have access to the technology to get it done.
And they had a program, One Laptop Per Child had a program that when you bought one, they gave one away to a kid that
That's
needed
right.
it.
That's
Yeah,
right.
so I
And it was
bought one
like
for my kids.
it had like a hand crank, so you could have, you
Yeah.
didn't have to plug into an electric socket or anything.
And their volunteer community, I remember I ran into one of them. I can still tell you what the hotel looked like. I don't remember what conference it was. Someone was walking around with one, and I was like, hey, is that a One Laptop Per Child computer? And he was like, yeah. And I was like, can I see it? And he must have sat with me for an hour and showed off this computer. And he had no stake in One Laptop Per Child. He just bought this computer and was super excited about it. I'm like, awesome way to get community involved.
They were cool looking computers too.
Yeah. They were like bright green, and they had a little
Yeah.
handle.
Yeah, it was rugged. It stood out. You know what immediately when you see it what it is.
We tried to partner with them when we started, but they couldn't provide the hardware the way that we wanted to work.
Why?
I don't know why on their end, but they couldn't provide the numbers that we needed for the schools that we wanted.
Oh, really? It was just like a supply chain issue.
Yeah.
That's weird.
I think they were working on agreements with governments. Like they wanted to provide like an entire country's worth of laptops, not like work school by school.
Steve, any final topics you want to cover?
Yeah, so Stormy, you worked at Microsoft back in, 2019 to 2021 as the director of open source programs. And I just wanted to hear from you, like, what that experience was like, because, Microsoft wasn't always super friendly with open source, but I think that's completely changed. And I just wanted to hear from you, like, what was your experience like in those couple of years at Microsoft doing that specific job as leading the open source programs office?
Yeah, it has completely changed. So Microsoft is super friendly to open source software. I do like to say that like 20 something years ago, the first role they played in open source was being the common enemy. Like when I was at GNOME, because it was all like, we're going to beat Windows. That was the phrase.
Oh, we used to refer to them as the evil empire, and it come full circle. It's crazy.
And I felt bad for the Microsoft folks that first showed up at open source software conferences because people weren't nice to them. And so when I accepted the job at Microsoft, I was actually on the Mozilla Funds board, and we decided how to distribute money to open source software projects, but you had to disclose, who your employer was. And I said, I've had a change of affiliation. And I said, I'm going to Microsoft. And I kind of like just waited to hear what was going to happen. And everyone was like super excited, and they all applauded, and they're like, well, Microsoft must really get it now. If you're willing to go there, they must have convinced you that they do care about open source. And I think they very much do. They use a tremendous amount of open source. I think the latest public numbers are like 80,000 different open source software projects. They contribute to a lot of open source software with VS Code and TypeScript and all those projects. So it's very much part of their DNA now. So
have you learned from anyone at Microsoft, like what the catalysts were for that change and like how the change was enacted? Because to get an organization that size to start changing its philosophy on something can't be easy.
Yeah, I think it was a core group of people that get a lot of credit. There's like a group of 5 or 10 people who were very instrumental in getting that to happen. I mean, they actually started first with creating like a wholly owned subsidiary, like a separate company, and everybody that worked at open source had to go not be paid by Microsoft, but be paid by this other company. And then they managed to show that it was working and get them back into Microsoft. There was a group of attorneys that was very key as well. Attorneys are always key to helping open source software and companies. They were just really good at describing the risk and like what the actual risk was. I think it was an amazing group of people.
Not just open source, but like Linux in particular. Like I know some really hardcore early Linux programmers, early Red Hat employees who rave about the Windows subsystem for Linux now. And they're like, yeah, no, I only run on Windows boxes because like the Linux environment in it is so good. I'm just like, when they first told me that, I was like, are you on drugs right now? What are we even talking about? And they convinced me. It's like,
yeah, there's definitely a very large group of people who definitely gets it at Microsoft.
So your move to the VP of Communities at GitHub was after the acquisition, right?
Yeah, it was after the acquisition. And my boss Thomas Domke actually took the CEO job and asked me if I wanted to come over. And I was like, yes, that's gotta be a dream job working at GitHub, helping the open source software community.
So how much involved is Microsoft in the day-to-day of GitHub, or have Microsoft just basically been an accelerator for GitHub?
The GitHub's still completely independent.
Okay.
Well, they are starting to move some of the infra from other cloud providers onto Azure. I've heard from friends who work at GitHub. I think that integration is starting to happen on the technical back end anyway.
There are opportunities where we can save money by partnering, but like Microsoft doesn't tell us how we have to do things. The cultures are very different. Like it feels like a different company. It's on different tool sets. We use Slack and Google Docs.
Yeah, I know Microsoft's a big believer in drinking their own champagne, especially when it comes to Azure. And I know they were, when I've interacted with Microsoft over the last few years, it seems like they really want to encourage this kind of competitive ecosystem internally where you're welcome to pick whichever Azure project you want to use for your software. And the teams that are building these infrastructure components are like, hey, you should use ours because it's way faster or whatever. So it's kind of fun to see that. So, Stormy, how do you compartmentalize the mindsets, and maybe you don't, between the Linux Foundation and working for Microsoft? Because you're also on you're the director on the board of directors, right?
I'm a director on the Linux Foundation board of directors. I was elected to represent the silver members. So GitHub's a silver member of the Linux Foundation.
Gotcha. So in your mind, and in Microsoft's mind, that must be completely fine and like a positive thing.
Yeah, Microsoft's a member of the Linux Foundation.
Oh yeah, I guess that's true. Yeah, I didn't think about that. So you don't have to worry about any sort of conflict of interest.
I do always think you need to, whenever you're a board member, you're supposed to be acting in the best interest of that foundation. That's your obligation, is to act in the best interest of that foundation. And then you just disclose if you have a conflict of interest or you think it's, your employer might not be wanting the best for that foundation, then you just disclose that so that you can.
Okay. So do you have specific goals in mind being part of the Linux Foundation that you want to achieve over the next few years? Or is that kind of not how you think about it?
That's a really good question. I think how AI and open source interact is a really interesting one that I think the Linux Foundation is going to be in the forefront of. It'll be really interesting to see. So yeah, things like that.
You mean like in terms of writing the code for Linux or building AI into the kernel, or what are you thinking about there?
Well, I am thinking about how developers use AI, what is open source with AI, but also speaking to earlier, how do those of us that were really involved in the beginnings of open source, what does AI need from its community? How do we help make sure that the AI community is an open collaborative community like the open source software community was? And what does that mean? And what do they need from us? Do they need people talking to legislatures? Do they need people educating the general public? Do they need more data sets? Do they need more developers?
Sort of not the non-technical problems.
Stormy, you just mentioned something interesting that I hadn't thought about, which is legislation. Have you ever been involved in that process of working with the government on specific things as they relate to technology?
I have gotten really awesome opportunities to talk to the European Commission or the United Nations or to the White House about how open source software is affecting different things.
Oh, really? Can you tell us about an experience? I'm just really curious, how that whole thing happens. Never even really gone into it much.
My first United Nations experience was pretty funny. We were all very nervous to get there. You had to show up early in the morning. Everyone's wearing suits. They had all the translators, with the headsets on. And I don't remember who all was there. I was there. Cory Doctorow was there, science fiction writer. And Richard Stallman was there. And
They let Stallman into the UN?
And he showed up late for the security thing and had everybody all angsty.
He didn't wear a suit,
Was
did
he
he?
wearing sandals?
I was going to say, he had to be in flip-flops and shorts.
I don't remember what he was wearing, but I remember he interrupted every speaker, and I was terrified he was going to interrupt me because I was already so nervous. I was I don't even know if I can do this. So I asked one of the speakers, I'm like, what did he say when he interrupted you? They're like, oh, that I should say free and open source, free software and not open source software. So I actually started my talk with, I'm sorry, Richard, I'm going to say open source software and not free software. Just so that he wouldn't interrupt
him.
Yes. And then when Cory was talking, he was talking really fast, and I was like, I don't know how the translators are going to handle this. So I switched to Spanish, which I speak Spanish, and I put it on my ears, and they were not getting all the words. I was like, gotta speak slower.
Gotta speak slower.
But it was interesting at that time. This was a while ago. The countries most interested in talking to us were a lot of the developing countries. I remember a lot of African countries there.
Do you see a lot of like positive change in places like Africa around software development and open source? Do you think that's going to be, I don't know what the right word is, like not a superpower, but like an innovation center for technology in the next 10, 20, 30 years?
I think it's really helping in education. So I think it's bringing opportunities to students there that they didn't have before. I think that hardware and internet are still a barrier to entry, though.
So Stormy, outside of AI, have you seen any other kind of cool applications of technology in your travels and in your experiences, like in robotics or anything else that's just kind of like surprised you or delighted you?
So robots are cool. I got to go visit a company in Boulder. They were part of my keynote at Universe, and they're working on robotics, and they use a lot of open source libraries to help them do that. So that is very cool. I think it's changing. And my favorite robot is actually my robot vacuum cleaner. That's what I always mention.
Same. I'm on team robot vacuum cleaner.
Yes, that was my job at home. So I'm just going to spend some money and my job's going to be done.
Well, it's funny you say that because during the podcast, I heard the vacuum cleaner hit my door a couple times. And I'm like, at some point, it's going to map this hallway and it's not going to hit the door.
What's taking it so long?
I don't know. Now that I think about it, it doesn't actually come down the hallway very often. So maybe the dogs head it off because they like to bark at it.
I have one dog that will just lie there and watch it hit him all the way around. And then I have another dog that follows it around and growls at it because it's,
Oh, that's funny.
They don't stand on it like the cats and go for a ride?
No, but I bet I could teach him to do that.
I have Frenchies, and I always see on Instagram the Frenchies that skateboard. And so last night I was thinking, I really want to get my dog a skateboard and see if he can do it. So I'm going to do it. We'll see if it'll work.
I just took my dog to a doggy fitness class last night, and there are actually exercises you do to teach them that all four of their legs work differently, or to be able to walk on just their back legs or their front legs.
Funny. I feel like we've gone off the rails here.
Yeah, sorry. All right, so Stormy, I like to ask people at the end, just in general, like when you think about people entering the IT field all the time, and we've been talking a lot about education and giving kids access to technology as early as possible, what are some of the lessons you think that we should be passing down to the next generation of people that are coming into the technology ecosystem?
I think the main lesson is just teaching them that anything is possible, that they can create solutions of their own. I think there's so much content out there now and so much is already done that it's easy to get caught in the it's already been done. Sometimes I see people that get started. It's frustrating to me because they'll create their own blogging tool or something. I'm like, why are you doing that? There's already one out there. But then it's part of their learning journey, right? That they learn how it works and they create their own. So I think encouraging them to continue is really important.
That's a good point. Yeah, when you think of startup ideas too, it's like this kind of minefield of, oh, well, this has been done, so I shouldn't go do it again. But we've seen just iterations of technology companies take out the old one. So you're right. Don't get discouraged just because it's been done before. It doesn't mean it can't be improved in some meaningful way.
Well, you never know where it's going to go. And you're absolutely right that it's easier for a small startup to innovate more rapidly than a big company. That's why it's sometimes big companies get taken out by small ones.
And easier for them to focus on a smaller problem set without having to make trade-offs with other pieces.
Are there lessons you think that we're not doing a good job of passing down? Does anything kick out in your mind where you see students coming out of school or university and they're still missing some fundamental pieces of knowledge?
So I agree with Chad. We could get it earlier and earlier. And I would love to see them know what computers can do as opposed to necessarily having to write code. I do sometimes think those of us that helped open source software get started worry that the younger generation doesn't care about licenses. And I think the lesson there isn't that licenses are important. The lesson is you need to make sure the things you care about are upheld or are valuable. You don't have to do it through licensing, but with AI, what parts do we care about and how do we make sure that's represented?
Well, the early people in open source were really, they were philosophical revolutionaries, out to change the world by doing this stuff and preventing information and other things from being locked down by corporate interests. I don't really hear people talk about it that way really anymore.
And we did change the world. Maybe not the way we originally, it might not be exactly what we imagined in the beginning, but we've changed the world. Look at the 100 million people with GitHub accounts that are looking and learning and creating things in open source software. So we've changed the world. I guess the question is, what do we want it to be next?
Yeah, I would agree with you. I mean, I wouldn't be here in the position I have in life if it weren't for open source. I mean, I've basically built my entire career off of it. So either using it to build software or then turning around and helping people adopt open source and, you know, finding the balance between price and performance, etc. But
yeah, I mean, same. I mean, that's why I was so deeply entrenched in the Linux community when I got out of college, because I was really bought into that idea. And yeah, you can put Linux on any computer basically for free in the world right now at any scale. And that's an amazing thing. But I don't know that the people who are, let's say, the next generation of programmers, do they feel as strongly about those ideals as the people who really kicked off the open source, the Stallmans and the Linuses and all of that.
But I think they have their own dreams, right? I think they're much more about creating content and creating a business off that content, you know, and that content should include software, I think.
I mean, the mindset of sharing is not lost. That's still very much a thing. And like content creators, I think, are one of the centers of gravity there, where they're sharing their learnings and things like that. That's how I learn on YouTube now. Like, I still think that's a thing, but it does seem like more and more it's people coming out saying, how can I go and build a business, which I think is cool. But I do wonder if they'll lose the plot on open source through that experience of just always thinking about how can I go make money off this thing. I mean, we obviously have to eat, but
I think with sponsors and Accelerator and GitHub Fund, we're seeing that people still want to create open source software.
All right, Stormy, thanks for joining us today. I mean, it was great to catch up with you. I haven't talked with you in a number of years, and I'm so happy that you were willing to join us. You've been so deeply involved in the open source world for so long, and it's a pleasure to have you here today. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me. It was fun.
Yeah, same here.
Thank you very much.
I love following your career on LinkedIn and seeing where you bounce around to every few years, because it's always something interesting. So, I mean, maybe you'll stay at GitHub for the rest of your career. I don't know, but maybe you'll bounce somewhere, and I hope we stay in touch.
We should talk more often.
All right. Thank you. And if you guys like this episode, please share it out on LinkedIn. Tell one other person. It is steadily growing over time, and you guys are helping us with that. Thank you. And we'll see you on the next episode. Bye-bye.
All right. Thanks, Stormy. Thanks, Chad.